For longer than I've been doing research, there has been a broad consensus that economics, the subject that is supposed to study the nature of exchange, has fundamentally misunderstood something about the origin of money. And that misunderstanding was christened by David Graeber the myth of barter. To understand this, we have to begin with the story European philosophers have told for thousands of years, and economists have repeated for centuries. Oldest account is Aristotle, but famous repetitions include Adam Smith. For variety here, I'm going to give you the version in the Moneta, a text by a Christian theologian, Nicholas Oresme, written in the 14th century, which runs like this. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people. Men were multiplied on the earth, and the possessions were divided to the best advantage. The result of this was that one man had more than he needed of one commodity, while another had little or none of it. And of another commodity, the converse was true. The shepherd had an abundance of sheep, and wanted bread. Men therefore began to trade by barter. One man gave another a sheep for some corn, another gave his labour for bread or wool, and so with other things. And this practice persisted in some states till long afterwards. But as this exchange and transport of commodities gave rise to many inconveniences, men were subtle enough to devise the use of money, to be the instrument for exchanging the natural riches which of themselves minister to human need. For money is called artificial riches, seeing that a man who abounds in it may die of hunger. For money does not directly relieve the necessities of life, but is an instrument artificially invented for the easier exchange of natural riches, and it is clear without further proof that coin is very useful to the civil community and convenient, or rather necessary, to the business of the state. That is a pretty simple, pretty compelling story, and as I said, nothing special about Oresme's version of it. I grabbed an introductory text on economics from my shelf, this one by Samuelson, and it has exactly the same story in it. Let's get the story straight in our heads. The assumption that philosophers and economists have made is that a long, long time ago, people were basically self-sufficient. But they would all be better off if they traded. And to do that, they bartered what they had, say chickens, rice, jewellery, or in our example, sheep, for what they didn't, say pigs, wheat, or tools. Key features of barter in these descriptions are that it is an immediate exchange of material goods the two parties both need, which is also the source of the difficulties economists see with it, that it only works if you need something now, if you both have something the other wants, and if what you're able to exchange are of roughly the same value. And in this story, the invention of money solved all of that. But there are problems with the story, problems that both anthropologists and numismatists have had for over half a century, and the reason that this is often called the myth of barter. Let's start with what bothers the anthropologists about this story. Anthropology, since its inception, has spent a great deal of time looking at societies that do not have money, or at least not something we would recognise as money, but which do have very complicated systems of exchange, systems that were very effective at facilitating exchange. And most of those systems don't involve barter. It's not that anthropologists never find examples of barter that look like the thing economists describe. They absolutely do. For example, Caroline Humphreys made a study of the Lomi community in the Nepal-Tibet region, which was published in 1985, and described the way that those communities used barter. But she does have two important caveats. The first is that the Lomi's use of barter seems to depend on some very specific local circumstances. Humphreys suggests that these include being indifferent to price, infrequent exchange, relative poverty, and a desire for autonomy. In other words, it's not a general alternative to money, but a specific response to unusual situations. The second point, which Humphreys acknowledges multiple times in the paper, is that her field just does not find very many examples of barter. As she notes, when people look at societies that don't use money, they are dominated by other activities considered to be more socially embedded, such as ceremonial exchange, gift-giving, sharing of food, or dues to chiefs. Barter is found in a corner of the economy. I'm not going to go into the complicated forms of exchange that often get grouped under the terms redistribution and reciprocity. The point being that they don't need to involve money, but they also don't look like the description of barter given by philosophers and economists. And unlike barter, they are everywhere. Anthropologists have found abundant examples of them. So let's look at why this story has bothered numismatists. Economists tend, as many people who have lived in many societies do, to conflate money and coin. Oresme is doing it in the Moneta. There were lots of forms of money in 14th century Europe that weren't coin. Oresme must have known about them, probably used some of them, but still talks only in terms of coin, as if the invention of money is the same as the invention of coins. The result is that economists tend to imagine money being invented at a very specific moment, about 2,600 years ago, because that is the moment in China and Lydia when coins were invented. They appear to imagine that the idea of money and its physical representation were invented almost simultaneously or very close together. And that idea bothers numismatists, for whom it does not seem to line up with any actual historical evidence. Philip Grierson, writing at the moment when numismatists began to think of themselves as students of physical representations of money rather than simple cataloguers of coins, had this to say on the topic. There are two separate problems involved, for although coins and money are frequently confused in ordinary speech, in studying their origin and evolution they have to be kept distinct. Coins are objects used to give concrete representation to monetary values, but they share the field with cattle, rings, cowries, paper money, bills of exchange, and so forth. Since coinage is a practical device that had been invented at specific times and places and transmitted by imitation from one society to another, its study can be carried out by methods to which the historian is accustomed. Money, on the other hand, has existed from time immemorial in virtually all societies. Oh, certainly, just as anthropologists have found people who barter, historians have found evidence that barter existed in the past. Before coins, certainly. Joe Cribb, writing on the origins of money, gives an example of a papyri receipt, 1,000 years older than coinage. But while it's older than coins, it's not older than money. There are plenty of papyri mentioning money that predate this, and it's also a little bit odd. This is a receipt for an exchange of one head of cattle for various items, mostly fabrics, but also some pots of fat. This is exactly what economists imagine as an alternative to, as the precursor of, money. And yet, the two people, Hay and Nebsman, have taken the trouble to assign a monetary value to every item and make sure they add up to the same. And that sort of makes sense because barter is presumed to involve a fair exchange. But it is also an example of why numismatists have begun to think that barter is not something that people did before money. It is something that people who are used to using money do when they don't have money. So, let's reiterate what the myth of barter is. Philosophers and economists have assumed for a long time that barter, the mutual exchange of material goods, is how people traded before they had money. But while this makes sense as a thought experiment, it doesn't seem to line up well with any actual evidence. Anthropologists have found barter is rare in societies that don't use money, and historians suspect that money itself is much, much older than barter. The myth of barter, it turns out, is just a story. I don't want to be too mean to economists. I think when some economists teach this story, they intend it as a thought experiment, a way of imagining how money works in our society by trying to imagine how we would trade if we didn't have it. As Isa pointed out to me, we did a whole episode, the lies we tell, on why these kinds of stories are useful and how easy it is for them to accidentally mislead. Because not everyone pursues a subject long enough to have the idea corrected. If you want a reading on this, and I would recommend that any course that covers this have a reading on this, the second chapter of David Graeber's book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, in which he coins the term Myth of Barter, is probably the best thing to recommend. Graeber didn't originate the idea, but he puts it very succinctly and effectively. I think it's important to understand why we're describing this as a myth, because while it might be a useful teaching tool, one of those lies we tell to introduce people to a concept, it's a bad description. It puts the cart before the horse. It prioritises having a neat, compelling theory over actually looking at evidence, which is why it has bothered numismatists and anthropologists so much. Money is old, and so are sophisticated modes of exchange. Our ancient ancestors did not live in some simple idyll sans everything we know. Ancient societies were sophisticated and complex and messy, and our descriptions of them, if they are to be accurate, are inevitably going to be incomplete, complicated, and messy. The myth of barter is neat and simple. That is what makes it appealing. But it is also why it's wrong.